It was on this wall that Tutmosis depicted a list of all the loot that he took from his military campaign. Dr. Emanuel Velikovsky, who is of Jewish origin, has made a comparison between what was in Solomon's temple, according to the record of the Book of Chronicles, and the items that are listed here, and he claims there's a very close similarity between those. For instance, you will notice up here the fire pans and the bowls, the dishes. There's something up here that looks very much like the Ark of the Covenant, with the poles through it by which the priests carried it. And there is an altar. It looks like a fire altar, such as would be expected from the Temple in Jerusalem. And then there is this other altar up here. Well, it looks more like 7 lampstands. That sounds a bit familiar. In particular, look up there. There are 2 doors. Do you see that? And they're golden doors. And it says in 1 Kings chapter 6 and in verse 32, the 2 doors were of olive wood, and he carved on them figures of cherubim, palm trees and open flowers, and overlaid them with gold. Golden doors. And so we have golden doors up here. Pharaoh Shishonk was the founder of the Libyan 22nd dynasty. And just around the corner here, he has left a relief which shows a list of cities that were in Palestine and Syria, and authorities have identified this list with the cities conquered by Shishak of the Bible. The list is somewhat similar, as you can see, these ovals with the heads on top, similar to the list that was left by Tutmosis III. But I don't consider this to be a valid identification. If this really was the Shishak of the Bible, what city would you expect to find at the top of the list? Well, Jerusalem, of course, but Jerusalem is not even in this list. Moreover, authorities consider that this is not a historical list, for some of the cities mentioned here had ceased to exist by the time of Shishonk. The Mitanni, in particular, had been wiped out 400 years prior to this list. So I don't consider this to be a valid identification. Tutmosis III had transformed Egypt from a nation into an empire by his military conquests. And from then on, the tribute flowed in from the surrounding nations, enabling the pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasty to build such massive temples and monuments. He was followed by Amenhotep II, or Amenhotep II. And he left a rather interesting statue, which is today in the Cairo Museum, and it depicts him as a devotee of the cow goddess Hathor. Up the front end, you see him under the protection of the cow goddess, and at the other end, well, he's drawing nourishment hot off the grid from this deity. After Amenhotep II came Tutmosis IV. And he has left rather an interesting stele between the paws of the Sphinx. He records there how he was to become the pharaoh as the result of a dream he had in which the Sphinx appeared to him and said, if you'll only clear the sand that is stifling me, I'll make you the next pharaoh. Now, some people have read a lot into this and tried to make out that he was made the pharaoh as the result of this dream. Well, I don't consider that to be plausible. It was simply a device the pharaohs had to claim the throne as a divine right. And so he simply claims that the Sphinx appeared to him and spoke to him. Well, he was followed by Amenhotep III, sometimes referred to as Amenhotep or Amenhotep the Magnificent, because of his tremendous building program. And the largest statue in the Cairo Museum depicts Amenhotep III and his wife with her arm affectionately round his waist. The magnitude of his building projects can be gauged from these 2 colossal statues of Amenhotep III, which once stood at the entrance of his great temple here at Luxor. To give you some idea of the enormous magnitude of this temple, do you see that stele away back there? Well, that marked the rear end of the temple, which stretched right forward to those two huge statues known as the Colossi of Memnon, which marked the front of the temple. Around the other side of this statue of Amenophis is a small statue of his mother, Matumwa. And on this side is a statue of his wife, T. Now, she's a bit cut down to size, of course, but anyway, he was apparently very devoted to her because she appears in so many statues, and it's a little difficult to understand why. If we go by a statue of her in the Berlin Museum, she is not exactly beautiful. But anyway, maybe she had a nice personality or something like that. Now, round the side of this statue, there is a very interesting symbolism. Can you see here two figures? And they're both of the river god Hapi, representing Upper and Lower Egypt. And do you notice how they're sort of tying something together? Well, after all, that's what the river Egypt does. It binds Upper and Lower Egypt together. And so this is a very fitting symbolism of the unity of Egypt, which the pharaohs tried to attain, and the river god Hapi binding Upper and Lower Egypt together. Now we come to a really intriguing era of Egyptian history. Following Amenophis III came his son, Amenophis IV. And this character adopted a new form of religion. He began to worship the sun god under the form of the god Aton, the sun disk. And he changed his name from Amenophis, which included the name of the god Amen, to Akhenaton, which incorporated the sun disk Aton. And his reliefs show him as worshipping this sun god. For instance, in this relief, which is in the Cairo Museum, we see him standing with hands upraised, worshipping Aton. And Aton, on the other hand, is reaching down its arms in extended blessing with hands outstretched upon the pharaoh and his wife. Now, Akhenaton was a grotesque figure if we're going to go by his statues. Thick lips, thin cheeks, protruding belly, thick thighs. Did he really look like this, or was it a new art form? There's a lot of advocates of the latter theory, actually, but personally I don't think anyone would want to be depicted like this unless he was really like this. It is true that the other members of his court also adopted a similar art form, but I think that was just following the fashion. Anyway, Akhenaton had some strange statues of himself. For instance, there's this one that shows him without any clothing on. Well, now, this was abnormal for a pharaoh. They were always modestly dressed. And this has given rise to a lot of speculation just why this should be. Was it because he was like this? Actually, you'll notice that something else is missing too. And this has led to suggestions that he was not able to procreate. But we do know that he had 6 daughters. You might say they were adopted. But if the pharaoh was going to adopt any children, you tell me, what would they be? Well, of course, they'd be sons. So it's quite apparent that he was able to procreate. Well, his beautiful wife, Nefertiti, has her statue made, and this head of her is in the Berlin Museum. It's a beautiful statue. I went to Berlin just purely and simply to see this statue, and I wasn't disappointed. And the extraordinary part is that it depicts her as blind in the left eye. Do you see that? Now, this has led to a lot of speculation too. Was she really blind, or didn't the artist finish his work? Or was the statue mutilated afterwards? Well, personally, I think that she did become blind in the left eye. And that would explain why she had a separate palace built for herself. Apparently, Akhenaton still loved her, but maybe he didn't want her as the retaining queen. And so, not wishing to banish her and yet not wishing to retain her, he built this separate palace for her down the other end of the new city that he'd built, Akhetaton, halfway between Memphis and Thebes. Now, Akhenaton apparently went through a very strange phase towards the end of his reign. And I think that is the reason that he is depicted in that statue that I showed you. Perhaps even, as some have suggested, he developed homosexual qualities. Whatever it was, his was an extraordinary reign and a strange era in Egyptian history. Akhenaten was followed by his younger brother, Tutankhaten, and he reverted to the religion of Amen, and so changed his name to Tutankhamen. In 1922, Howard Carter made the spectacular discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. It's way down there in the valley, and later on in this series we're going to have a full program on Tutankhamun. You want to stay around for that, it's exciting. Tutankhamun was succeeded by Ai and then by Horemheb, who went round the land of Egypt smashing all the statues of Akhenaten and demolishing all his temples. So this is where the archaeologists have stacked the stones from Akhenaten's smashed temple. And from the beautiful reliefs you can see what a magnificent temple it was. This is the way the 18th dynasty came to its end. Ramesses I is usually considered to be the first king of the 19th dynasty, and he was followed by Seti I, and then came Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great. And Seti and Ramesses II were responsible for this huge hypostyle hall, 134 massive columns in this great hypostyle hall. Ramesses was really great because he was a compulsive builder, and he also fought the famous Battle of Kadesh depicted on his reliefs. He was often rejoiced to be able to tell about the Battle of Kadesh. And if you still don't think Ramesses was great, just consider this. He had 92 sons and 106 daughters. And if that doesn't make a man great, you tell me what does. Well, Ramesses also was responsible for the magnificent temple of Abu Simbel. And there also he depicts his battle against the Hittites at Kadesh, and we will have more to say about them in our next program. But Ramesses also made provision for his death. This is the Ramesseum, which is his mortuary temple, still in remarkably good condition. Even the roof is intact. And lying on the ground, you can see a statue of Ramesses, which is the biggest statue in the land of Egypt. You can get an idea of the enormous size of this statue by just looking at the feet. Well, Ramesses the Great died, of course. He ruled for 67 years. And that is his mortuary temple away over there in the distance. And he was succeeded by his son Meneptah. Now, Meneptah left a stele, which is very important, just for one word that occurs on it, the word Israel. It's the only place in all the land of Egypt that the word Israel occurs. Now, Meneptah is not saying that he conquered Israel, he's simply recording a historical fact. He says, Israel is destroyed, her seed is no more. And personally, I consider this refers to the Assyrian invasion of Palestine and the exile of the 10 tribes of Israel into Assyria. We are at Medinet Habu, a temple of Ramesses III. And in this relief that you see here on the wall, Ramesses has his club lifted and he's about to bash somebody's brains out. And he is depicting here his battle with what are referred to as the peoples of the sea. Now, this battle is supposed to have occurred around 1200 BC. But there's some awkward anachronisms involved here by this present dating. One is, for instance, that Ramesses III is supposed to be repelling these peoples of the sea who swept over Anatolia around 1200 BC and annihilated the Hittites. But we have a relief of Shalmaneser III in his obelisk in which he refers to his battle with the Hittites. So here you are in the 9th century BC, and here's Shalmaneser fighting the Hittites, who are supposed to have been extinguished 1200 BC. You see, it just doesn't fit. And then too, in this gateway over here, there is obvious Assyrian influence. And you've got to date that to either the 8th or the 9th century BC. So where did Ramesses III get this concept from? Well, you can't say that he anticipated Assyrian influence. It is much easier to say that Ramesses III was a later date. And that's where I think it should be. In other words, what he is depicting here is his conflicts with the Assyrians. And that would put it around the 8th century BC. There's just one more thing that's rather interesting. Ramesses III has a palace, or had a palace, down in the delta at a place called Tel Yehuda. Now, some tiles were found there, if you please, and they also showed Persian influence, by the way. But on the back of the tiles, there were some Greek letters. Now, these Greek letters were intended so that they could put them all in the right place, you see. But the problem is, the Greek alphabet was not invented until 800 BC. And yet here is Ramesses supposed to be making these tiles 1200 BC. So I think all the evidence really points to the fact that this is Ramesses III fighting a battle with the Assyrians around about the 8th century BC. And as far as the sea peoples who are involved, well, the Assyrians simply conscripted the Phoenician navy and used them in their battles against the Egyptians. Well, we're just about down to the end of the history of ancient Egypt. We come down to the time of Pharaoh Hophra. He's mentioned in the biblical account in Jeremiah chapter 44 and in verse 30, where it says, "Behold, I'll give Pharaoh Hophra, king of Egypt, into the hand of his enemies." Hophra is to be identified with Pharaoh Apries. And this pharaoh left rather a cute sort of an obelisk that is today perched on the back of an elephant outside the Pantheon in Rome. The prophets of Israel were beginning to predict the doom of Egypt. Ezekiel 30 and verse 13 says, "I will also destroy the idols and cause the images to cease from Noph. There shall no longer be princes from the land of Egypt." Well, that's exactly what happened. The Persian invasion came in the 4th century BC, and Cambyses smashed this statue of Ramesses the Great here in Luxor. The great conqueror Alexander the Great came here 332 BC, and this relief shows him worshipping the god Amun. In the latter centuries came the Romans. Here, for instance, is Diocletian's pillar down there at Alexandria, sometimes referred to as Pompey's pillar. In the 7th century came the Islamic invasion, and finally we come down to the present state of the United Arab Republic of Egypt. And right down to the present time, there has never been a native prince in the land of Egypt over the last more than 2,000 years. And the idols have been smashed. Everything is just as the Bible says. So it seems the Bible knew what it was talking about.
What makes Egypt so exciting, I believe, is its ability to take you back in time to the glories of its long-lost past empire. An empire that was once nearly lost to the powerful Hittites. To find out more about this relief of Ramesses the Great fighting the Hittites, we take you in our next program to Turkey. There we'll be visiting the weird and wonderful world of Cappadocia, with its incredible underground cities and geological formations. Although they nearly succeeded in defeating the Egyptians, the Hittites were lost from history for thousands of years. The scholars even denied their very existence. Until recently, that is. Don't miss this next exciting episode of Digging Up the Past, when David reveals the dramatic story of how the Hittites were found once again.